Good morning, everyone. Hello to all the folks who joined us yesterday, and hello to the folks who are here for today. We had a great day yesterday. We learned a lot about some very inspirational programs that are doing some exciting things, and we have more of that in store for you today. Next slide. Some quick reminders, we're talking about a study that is being done through the offices of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. Next slide. And the academies, as well as this committee, have certain practices for conduct and engagement. We want to remind everyone that this is a space where we respect diversity. We do not support or allow any way discrimination, harassment, or bullying. And that this is an environment, a space where we want to maintain professionalism and cordiality. Particularly as a committee, we want to have a safe and inclusive environment that fosters belonging. So some of that is, if you're speaking for the first time, please mention your name and affiliation, mute yourself when you're not talking, and use the raise hand function when you'd like to ask a question so that we can be sure to acknowledge you and hear from you. Next slide. Oh, I should have introduced myself. My name is Kiki Jenkins. I'm an associate professor at Arizona State University and the chair of this committee. So a quick overview of this study. This is a 24-month consensus study sponsored by BOEM, Office of Naval Research, NOAA, and the National Science Foundation. We are entering into our third meeting, hybrid meeting, and this report is slated to be released in the summer of 2025. Next slide. Here's your statement of task. I won't read through this. You can find the statement of task on the committee website, as well as additional information about the study and the committee members. Next slide. Here are all the committee members. They are excellent group of people who are really contributing a lot to this process. We are fortunate to have them. Next slide. And this is our project timeline. So you can see we're about midway through some of our key milestones. This is the third meeting, as I mentioned. We'll have one more in-person or hybrid meeting in February, and then we'll enter the peer review process with getting the final report at the end of summer in 2025. Next slide. I really encourage you all who are new to this particular study to sign up for updates. We want the community to know this is happening. We want the community to engage with us, share information with us, ask us good questions. And so to do that, you need to sign up for notifications through the study website. You may already be signed up to receive notifications through the Ocean Studies Board, but for this particular study, to get our updates, you need to go and sign up there. So again, that's something that you will do through the website, which is probably in the chat that here often, and there's also a link on the screen. Okay, next slide. Here's our agenda. This is a reminder for those who maybe had not remembered yesterday what we talked about. We did a series of lightning talks. We focused on undergraduate and graduate programs in STEM in general. We're doing some exciting things in the diversity, equity, and innovation space. Next slide. And then in the afternoon, we had undergraduate and graduate programs that were specifically focused on ocean sciences. And then a closed session with us committee. Today, we are going to move and have lightning talks from ocean studies funders and philanthropic organizations. Really excited to hear from them. And then in the late morning, we'll have our final open session, which is postgrad, academic staff, and professional societies and organizations who are focused on nurturing and supporting individuals through their careers with an eye towards diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM and ocean adjacent science spaces as well as ocean spaces. And then the committee is in closed session again. Next slide. Just a reminder, if you are physically in space, these are emergency exits. We have them right out the door. So know how to get out in case there's any issues. Next slide. Logistics, so you all have managed to get onto Zoom, that's great, remember to keep your speakers off unless you are speaking. And we encourage you, if you are comfortable, to keep your cameras on, just to grow a sense of community, and to make it less boring when you're just looking at online for so long a day. And just remember to keep yourself muted when you're not speaking so that we don't have any distracting noises coming through. Next slide. And finally, and importantly, we want to acknowledge the way we are gathered. We acknowledge that we gather on the traditional lands of the Choctaw and Piscataway people, past and present. And honor with gratitude the land itself, and the people who have stewarded it through the generations. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. We thank them for their resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities to their example. And that last part I think is really resonates with us as committee's work is our aspirations to upholding responsibilities, both the responsibilities that come with this land and the responsibilities that come with this nation of being one that aspires to make sure everyone has an equitable and inclusive experience, which really in STEM. And with that, we're going to start this day with our first lightning talk session that's being chaired by one of our committee members, or moderated by one of our committee members, Paul Barber.
Thank you, Kiki. So yesterday we heard from a variety of different programs focused on undergraduate and graduate students. This morning we're going to start with hearing from a number of organizations that are increasing diversity, equity, inclusion in ocean sciences through the implementation of inclusive funding practices. So the lightning talks will each be 7 minutes. Please feel free to put questions into the chat as they come to you. And after we've heard from our 4 groups of speakers, we'll return to have an open discussion with them. So with that, our first speakers are Grace Ha and Leonard Pace from the Schmidt Foundation.
Are my slides flowing okay?
Looks great.
Yep.
On behalf of all the members of the Schmidt Ocean Coalition, we thank you for this opportunity to present the work we've done to support inclusivity, diversity, equity, and access, or IDEA, in marine-related career pathways. My name is Leonard Pace, and I represent one member of a group of unique philanthropies that have come together to help provide opportunities for programs seeking to increase the participation of underrepresented groups in marine fields. The image on this slide is from one of our first grantees, who I'm sure you are familiar with, Dr. Nikki Traylor-Knowles, at the conference she built to bring Black women in ecology, evolution, and marine science together last year. The Ocean Coalition represents 3 philanthropies created by Eric and Wendy Schmidt as they support a wide range of initiatives related to society and environment, of which oceans is an important component. 11th Hour Racing works to mobilize sports, maritime, and coastal communities with an innovative approach to inspire solutions for ocean and promote collaborative systemic change through 3 primary areas of engagement. The Schmidt Family Foundation's program, Schmidt Marine Technology Partners, or SMTP. Their mission is to help teams move promising marine technology ideas toward economic sustainability and global impact. And Schmidt Ocean Institute, or SOI, they work to see the world's oceans understood through technological advancement, intelligent observation, and the open sharing of information. A small committee from across the 3 organizations began meeting over Zoom in summer of 2020 in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder and the Black Lives Matter protests. We were compelled by our love of ocean fields and a deep understanding that we all needed to do better when it came to including and supporting a greater diversity of people. We spent time getting to know one another, learning about each of our respective entities, and what we found was that separately we were already doing pieces of IDEA work, For instance, 11th Hour Racing was funding a number of grantees doing K through 12 ocean literacy programs in underserved communities. SOI was running multiple educational outreach programs geared toward middle and high school students that were developed with accessibility and affordability in mind. And SMTP had sponsored internships through Environmental Grantmakers Association to place graduate students from historically underrepresented backgrounds with grantee organizations. These individual components felt piecemeal relative to the big systemic issues that we were facing, but collectively our work spanned across the entire life cycle of ocean education and workforce development. So we honed in on this fact as a starting point for our coalition. With the enthusiastic support from each organization's executive leadership from the beginning, we've been able to create the Ocean Coalition as an organized program across our 3 entities. We focus our work on deeply listening to our grantees, learning from them about their needs and the lessons that they've learned. And in doing so, we've found several resonant themes. First was the importance of relationships. Almost all of our grantees talked about how the community partnerships that underpin their work took time, sometimes years or even decades to develop, and that these relationships were key to the meaningful programs that they were working on. Funding is a constant challenge for many of them. Most of our grantees are operating on very tight budgets, with a number of their leaders hardly compensating themselves for the work that they're doing. Most of our grantees are small and emerging organizations, and they talked about having to learn on 2 fronts: internally to develop organized and sustainable operations, and externally to understand what has often been a complicated and opaque funding landscape. And lastly, our grantees told us that working on IDEA required holistic approaches. One can't just lead a youth program if their students are coming in without enough to eat, and you can't really broaden access to international dialogues for deep sea research without thinking about the additional costs of transportation, housing, and who's left behind at home when the primary caretaker is away conducting that research. Working together has helped us to think about how people do not engage with the ocean via a single pathway, since each of us have not entered the ocean space in the exact same way. Nor do people necessarily engage in a single linear path, as this diagram might suggest. Pathways aren't clear. Instead, like a watershed, there are lots of ways people engage, develop, and advance within ocean fields. The pathways to become an ocean steward and leader are myriad, and it is no less important for an individual to go into academia versus the nonprofit sector versus social entrepreneurship, or even simply become a mentor or teacher who cares about the marine environment and works to pass that legacy on to others. The ecosystem of access points is not evenly distributed, and more needs to be done to broaden and sustain engagement, bolster the seeds of creativity, and usher in the next generation of ocean stewards. Building upon that ecosystem from various stages of the K-12 educational system to the informal and trade-oriented maritime programs that might fall under non-traditional learning, to professional networks and affinity spaces that advance and retain diverse leaders, this is what the Ocean Coalition is focused on through our grant making. Now, I know this is a lot of images, and I don't want you to focus on each individual logo. Instead, we've put all our grantees on here to give you a sense of how collectively they and we are working across the whole braided river to build myriad pathways for engagement. Each of our grantees have their focus areas, but even then, they're not just doing work with K-12 students, or just developing skills training programs for non-traditional students, or just creating a safe space for minoritized ocean professionals. For many, they're operating with holistic mindsets, and this schematic does not really do justice to how they're both working in and beyond their respective lanes for the sake of their communities. The Ocean Coalition started with 2 $50,000 grants and a $15,000 sponsorship in 2021. And this year, we're proud to have grown and granted over $2 million across 19 grantees and convenings. And that support has been primarily made to programs whose leaders are Black, Indigenous, or peoples of color, or BIPOC. And going into next year, we're looking forward to continuing to work with our grantees to provide them flexible support, and we're establishing our first multi-year grants. All in all, we're seeing a rising movement for marine IDEA happening not only in small communities here and there, but nationally and internationally, even despite funding challenges and coordinated attacks. We are seeing this in our grantees and their partners, as well as in national arenas and conferences such as Upwell and Capitol Hill Oceans Week. And as funders, we have an opportunity to help support our grantees to see their work through. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the questions during the question and answer period.
Great, thank you so much for that, Leonard. Our next speaker is Vanessa Constant from the National Ocean Protection Coalition.
Hi all, good morning. Thank you for having me. My name is Vanessa Constant. I am the Policy Director with the National Ocean Protection Coalition, or as we refer to it, NOPC. Next slide, please. So NOPC is a coalition of more than 50 organizations with national, regional, and local perspectives from across the United States. We work every day to create and enhance equitable and effective marine protected areas, which are special places that help to ensure a healthy ocean for the benefit of people and serve as a refuge for the wildlife that call these places home. We also strive to activate our collective power by convening people and organizations. Next slide, please. As part of that, we are committed to reflecting and supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout our work. That means advancing priorities that are driven by an overarching strategy grounded in inclusion that begins with small yet meaningful steps for incremental and deep-rooted change. Next slide, please. We recognize that only with a broad and diverse coalition of partners can we achieve a healthy ocean that supports thriving nature, people, and communities. Next slide. Unfortunately, these can be considered newer acknowledgements in our field, which has been reckoning with historical and contemporary inequities. And to adapt to this shift, the field and several organizations within it have made concerted efforts to center diversity, equity, and inclusion, which has ushered in new frameworks and ideas, investments from public and private funders, reflections and examinations of strategic and enhancement practices that prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion, and honestly, earnest efforts to create meaningful change. And during the last 4 years, NOPC in particular has been responding to these dynamics by focusing on, or focusing specifically resources and energy toward diversity, equity, and inclusion capacity. And what that looks like for us is increasing the diversity of members and voice, prioritizing community-engaged policy work, and dedicating financial resources to support diverse and under-resourced voices, their perspectives, and the communities from which they come. Next slide, please. The foundation for our diversity, equity, and inclusion work was built upon our commissioning of a report in 2021 that used an internal audit, a coalition survey, and an external analysis to provide recommendations on how to integrate and institutionalize diversity, equity, and inclusion within our organization and throughout all of its pursuits. The findings from that report led to specific and actionable strategies to build NOPC's internal capacity. That report was published in 2021, and over the next 2 years, so 2022 and 2023, NOPC invested significantly in providing resources and funding for diverse leaders to attend key conferences and events, elevating the voices of diverse partners through communication and public forums, partnering with interested Indigenous communities on key policy efforts, and establishing a grant program to support local communities in their conservation projects. In 2024, NOPC hired an independent consultant to continue the evaluation of all of these facets of this work and the coalition's perception of diversity, equity, and inclusion progress made, and to guide all of our future work. We provided opportunities for our partners to share experiences, reflections, and vision along the way, and it is ongoing. Next slide, please. At the end of the day, all of this work is grounded in an ongoing commitment to learning, evaluating, and integrating. It requires a willingness to try things out, to reflect on the opportunities and honestly some of the mistakes as well, and to consistently show up for the work. And for us, it's a mission imperative, which means that we cannot be successful without our DEI commitment, and it is truly forever work. Next slide, please. To conduct these efforts, we believe you need 3 key things, at least 3 key things. 1 is policy, 2 is people, and 3 is funding. You need a very clear vision or a policy that is concise and directive. It demonstrates your commitment to and prioritization of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and is accompanied by action. You also need people. That means staff and paid individuals to do this work, including partners, and that could mean honorarium for support or support for their time and the knowledge that they share. And lastly, we think you need funding. You need resources and basically money to implement the projects, the policies, and the trainings or convenings that you're having. Next slide, please. So I've briefly touched on some of the internal work that NOPC has done to continue learning, evaluating, and integrating from the 2021 published report to the 2024 evaluation. I'd like to now highlight one of our external facets of the commitment to our diversity inclusion work, which is our grant program. Next slide, please. So in the fall of 2022, NOPC launched a grant program to distribute funds to partners for projects that advanced shared coalition goals around ocean protection and equitable access to nature. The grant program prioritized initiatives led by or serving Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Pacific Islander, Asian, and other historically marginalized communities. Our grants were awarded to partners for projects such as enhancing language access across public hearings, conducting a cultural exchange across Pacific First Nations, and a summer camp educating youth on Chumash maritime culture. And what was different about this specific effort was that we named BIPOC applications as a priority. We didn't say it was a requirement to apply, but we did say it was an interest. And the first year, every single application was either BIPOC-led or BIPOC serving. Next slide, please. How we did it. We had a clearly defined vision and impact. We wanted to advance the America the Beautiful priorities, and all applicants had to fall within that range. We also reduced the barriers to engagement. So we simplified our application system and the reporting requirements to align with the capacity of the communities that we were interested in having applied to this grant program. Next slide, please. And the impact was, honestly, flexibility led to greater creativity and impact for the communities, their needs, their ways of knowing, their personal priorities. And through this program, we were also able to help them build a foundation or like a proof of concept for the ways that their programs could ultimately expand and receive additional funding. At the end of the day, the number of the applicants for both years, which to date the program has run for 2022 and 2023, far exceeded our resources. So in other words, there was a lot of interest, which is a great thing. Next slide, please. To wrap up, we believe it's really important to constantly ask questions and reflect on the experience and process and use it as an opportunity to learn and grow. We also value the experts. We could not have done any of this work without individuals helping us along the way. There are so many excellent resources and people that are leading in this work that can serve as an inspiration or collaborators to guide you in the process. And lastly, we believe in creating career opportunities and speaking opportunities along the way. So I didn't have too much time to talk about the career opportunity piece, but there are ways that we do that as well. So next slide, please. Thank you all so much for your time. And I can't wait for the question section.
Thank you so much. Just a couple quick things. One, if you have questions, again, please put those in the chat. We'll return to those during our discussion section. Also, I don't know if this is a problem in our room here at the National Academies or if other people are having issues with the sound cutting out occasionally, but the closed captioning is picking up the entire conversation. So if you are having issues with the sound, I'd suggest turning on the closed captioning so that you can capture the full extent of our discussion. So next, we have Karen Tingley from the Wildlife Conservation Society.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Karen Tingley. I'm the Vice President of Education for Zoos and Aquarium for the Wildlife Conservation Society. So I oversee all of the learning and engagement that happens in our 5 parks in New York, including the Bronx Zoo and the New York Aquarium. And one of the things that I think a lot about in my role is our vision for the organization and for the education department. We're committed to creating a diverse and inclusive movement of conservation advocates and STEM professionals. And in order to do this, we have to, oh, next slide, just hitting my button. In order to do this, one of the things that's really important is to think collectively about who is in the room when decisions are made, who are we engaging with in our local communities, and why it's so important that that happens. And we recognize that there are large populations of historically excluded communities who are not a part of solution making when it comes to ocean conservation, when it comes to career development, exploration, what kinds of questions are asked in science research programs. And we are committed to making that change happen. Next slide. We recognize that those barriers are certainly there, and one of the things that as an education professional we think a lot about is this idea of a lack of quality STEM education. We recognize that particularly in New York City there is an increased focus on literacy and math. And science is being left behind. There are some science courses, but many times those are enrichment programs that are funded by PTAs and not necessarily at a local level. And so looking for partnerships and organizations like nonprofits, museums, zoos, and aquariums to really help augment and provide support, not only in the schools, but also thinking about how we can look on the broader levels of community organizations. There's also this passion tax. We all know this. Oh, it's so great. You're part of this wonderful program. You get to go out and go scuba diving. You get to, talk with marine professionals. You must love your job. And this perception that pay is not necessarily the main driver. We recognize that people do need livable wages. And unfortunately, the pursuit and how you get to those marine science careers many times comes with a lot of unpaid internships, social capital, things like that. And something that we've been thinking a lot about lately is this idea of the impact that climate change has on communities, particularly those who are coastal communities. Education is disrupted, community opportunities are disruptive, financial barriers that are coming in are really significant. And the idea of going and pursuing something like a STEM career feels not necessarily like the best option, particularly when you're focused on something at the ocean level. Next slide. And so when thinking about this, we think about the role that education can play. And we look, it's interesting, Leonard, you talked about this idea of an ecosystem, and that's the model that we look at. We look at not just schools, but all the different organizations that can come together and prepare students. But we also look at the support that teachers need. 86% of teachers are really thinking about climate and ocean issues, but feel unprepared on how to teach that. And so the focus on teacher education, on student education is such an important component. We have a long-standing professional development program where we have been training teachers for almost 50 years. And it's in direct science content. Most elementary school teachers get a half a semester of science content as their preparation to teach science. So looking at how we can provide that science content, increasing self-efficacy in teachers to be able to teach the kind of content, and also providing a larger network and a community of practice for teachers. Next slide. It's also important to think about this climate and ocean science connection as a social justice issue. We are well aware that climate change disproportionately affects historically excluded communities. We also recognize that many times organizations come in and try to make decisions, whether it's climate, whether it's ocean policy, a wide variety of things. And it's an expert that comes in and tells the community what they need. And it's important that we think about how we can step back and support leaders from communities who really understand what their communities need and how we can support to make that happen. By intrinsically linking ocean conservation and ocean science to social justice, we can really think about how to meaningfully move this field forward. And it might mean asking different kinds of questions, doing things in a different way, kind of breaking down those long-standing traditional barriers. Next slide. And a major way to do this is to thinking about investing in those education opportunities. We have a program at the New York Aquarium called the Youth Ocean Advocates Program, where we train local high school students in ocean science and policy, and then provide opportunities for them to go in local communities, to talk about the work that's impacting their local community, and also to advocate on a larger level. They're actively involved in the Hudson Canyon designation and are regularly, acting as advocates for their communities. We also look at the idea of implementing paid internships. This is a really important component. Next slide. We at WCS recognized that we had significant issues with internships. Many were unpaid, required high social capital to get them. And so a couple of years ago, with support from the Institute for Museum and Library Services, as well as New York City Council, we were able to completely reimagine our internship program. And we now have 450 compensated internships across WCS. And Kayleen is one great example. Next slide. It's also important to set and measure those goals. And we'll go to the next slide because I'm running out of time. And we did this through a program called the WCS Career Lattice, which is our integrated career pathways program. We support 1,900 young people in volunteer internship and paid employment opportunities. And when this program started in 2018, our diversity levels were very low. And over the past 8 years, we've been able to 6 years, we've been able to completely transform who is a part of those volunteer internship and employment opportunities, which is a really great service. And I can provide a link to our website for more information. And last slide. And just to pull this all together, it's this idea of collaborating with our local communities, prioritizing ocean literacy and accessible pathways, and working to ensure that all people have access to this work, and that we're open to different viewpoints. And the last slide, I have citations, and I'm happy to provide those links as well. So thank you so much.
Great, thank you. Once again, just a reminder to please add questions to the chat. We'll return back to those during our open discussion. So at this point, we will open up the floor for questions and discussion with all four of our speakers. So maybe I'll start with one question for all four of our groups here today. The consensus study that we're participating in is being funded by a number of federal agencies, including those that are engaged in awarding grants to fund ocean studies work. I know foundations often fill a particular niche in the funding space, particularly in areas that aren't effectively served by federal funding agencies. But one of our goals is to provide recommendations to these funding agencies and the community at large. So the question I have for all of you is, from where you sit in your foundations, what are things that federal funding agencies could do that would, improve equity and inclusion in their funding practices and catalyze a more rapid diversification of the ocean studies workforce? And I don't know if anyone wants to take that first, but I'd love to hear from all of you.
Well, I'll jump in. I think one really key thing that we have focused on is sort of recognizing that federal funding agencies often have a lot of process that they have to deal with in terms of putting money out there. So one thing that we've tried to do is to partner with federal agencies, because we can be a lot more flexible in how we fund. You know, Jason mentioned we did a request for proposals process for the Including Indigenous Knowledge. Sometimes we do RFPs, sometimes we scope through ideas labs, which are workshops that bring together diverse audiences to come up with research needs together. Other times we scope one-on-one. It really depends on the needs of the issue. And so I think for federal agencies, one thing I'd recommend is to really reach out and build partnerships with other funders so that they can expand the tools in their own toolbox to address their needs and to reach more people.
I'll jump in next. I have a thing that we've been working on it in the Ocean Coalition, and that's reserve funding. We recently learned about this plan for organizations to have a pot of money after the grant that we make in the future to support their needs going forward. A lot of federal funding has to be spent in a fiscal year. If the federal government allowed their grantees to hold that money in reserve, that would allow those grantees, if they weren't awarded a grant next year or the following year, to be able to survive for another month, 2 months, 3 months in order to find another grant or to pay a student worker for whatever they needed for. The Ocean Coalition, we're looking at allowing up to 10% of any grant to just be for reserve so that the grantees can start having a bank of funds that is there for the rainy days. And if the federal government could do that, that'd be a huge, huge asset to a lot of folks.
I can chime in. Something that we definitely incorporate into our work is making sure that it's part of your mission and vision, so that you're responsible for reporting on it, for delivering on the things that you commit to, and that it's a continued commitment. So ongoing across years. This is not just a one and done. This is something that should be part of everything that you do all the time. We also believe in increasing the transparency. So like all of the efforts that you're working to do, those things, make sure that they're getting out far and wide, all the solicitations for applications, streamlining grant processes. So making sure that they're actually easy to access and deliver upon and report on. And if they're not, then make sure that there are resources and individuals available to help support and help navigate people through those processes, because I'm familiar with the system and it's also hard for me. So I can't even imagine what it might be like for someone who's very new to this space. And then there are some other creative ideas. They could create friends programs or training programs, things that build more awareness among the general public about the work that they do and how they can get involved. And then for the specific lens of marine protected areas where we sit, there could be training programs for contributions and sanctuary advisory councils. There could be just generating local programs to create advocates outside of the systems in which they work, or management and advisors. So a few ideas there. Hopefully that's helpful.
I can chime in too, and supplement to the great comments already said. I think one of the things that's important to consider is within an institution that's trying to advance principles of diversity, equity, inclusion, and transparency, if that's part of it, and really to build that in. I think, most of the institutions, whether they're funders or they're federal offices, are really complex and have different components operating in different parts of either providing resources or providing support that really would be, influenced and engaged with diversity, equity, inclusion. So understanding the broader picture internally of how to create that vision, but also to socialize that among the different components of the institution to make sure that everybody's rowing in the same direction towards the same goals, and everyone knows kind of what their responsibilities are and how they can reflect those principles in the work that they do, whether it's creating new programs as an idea, but also creating, the relationship language or the grant language, whether it be, opening up pathways of bringing in different partners that the institution hasn't hasn't worked with before. Different parts of larger institutions need to be need to understand what the vision is and what their part is and how to be flexible enough to increase the diversity, equity, inclusion across the board, so that the whole institution is moving forward in the same pace, in the same direction.
Questions from the,
Kiki.
oh, sorry, yep. So I'm looking at the big screen instead of my little screen.
A lot of information
Um,
coming at you.
Yes, thank you, Kiki.
Maybe we can
so-
switch them so we can see the people on the big screen instead of looking at ourselves on the big screen.
Yeah.
Can we do that, Safa? Okay, so my question, there's two parts to this question. Schmidt and the National Ocean Protection Coalition, you both mentioned that you had a new focus or renewed efforts in and around 2020 in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion. And so I was curious for the Wildlife Conservation Society and also LendFest, what your timeline was for the initiation of the current efforts that you're discussing with us. And then for all of you, 2020 was a very different space than where we find ourselves in 2024. And the risks and concerns with doing this work in 2024 are very different. How are you all engaging with that different climate? Do you see yourself persisting in this work? Do you see yourself changing in how you're engaging in this work in light of that climate?
I can go first. So the education department created a DEI plan in 2016. We're based in New York. So this is something that is a need not only for our teams, but also our local communities. So we developed a DEI plan that really focused on things that were within our locus of control, even though the organization had not yet developed a DEI plan. So we looked at increasing representation. We looked at removing barriers to applications and participation, developing strong community partnerships through recruitment, and looking at diverse funding strategies focused on things like workforce development, and really thinking about how we could meet local community needs. This work then continued as the organization developed DEI plans. Going into where we are in 2024, it's just a part of our DNA. And while there may be, national trends going one way or the other, we just see this as an integral part of what our mission is, not only because of it's the right thing to do from a conservation perspective, it's really the only thing to do to be able to meet our community needs as well as the needs of wildlife and wild places.
Thanks. George, I believe you're next.
Did I hear
Oh.
the answer?
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I can jump in next.
Okay, go ahead, Leonard.
So I'll keep it brief. So for the Ocean Coalition, we absolutely plan to continue this work. Our funding has only been increasing, and we get lots of support from our founders to keep doing this kind of work. For us, the future multi-year granting is important to us. And a lot of the granting we've been doing has been US focused. And as you can see from the map behind me, the Schmidt Ocean Institute and our research vessel Palcor 2 is dedicated to the Southern Hemisphere for the next decade. We're looking to do some international work moving forward because the oceans touch us all and we want to be able to reach other communities as well. And yeah, I'll stop there. I'll pass it back.
And jump in here, Jason. For us, this is a little bit of a tough question because it turns out the LendFest Ocean program is actually sunsetting in June of 2025. And so I would like to say that we're going to continue this work, but we actually won't be around. So those projects that Jason and I mentioned, both in including Indigenous knowledge and managing protected areas, they run up through the end of LendFest. And so they were first funded. The managing protected areas, the group of projects was funded last August of 2023. And then including Indigenous knowledge are 1.5 year projects that started in last January. Is that correct, Jason? Yeah, so that's definitely, that's our situation. At the same time, we have taken on doing a ton of work to try to share our approaches and to encourage other philanthropic funders these concepts, both in the international space with the UN decade on the ocean, as well as just among our community of philanthropic funders, because we do believe there's a lot of need for improvement in that, including for ourselves. You know, our mission of, you know, funding useful, usable science, it meant our approaches, it was a natural extension to take up DEIT concepts of what we were aiming to do in the first place. But I think we came to recognize it's not just something that sort of happens because that's part of the mission. It takes a lot of really proactive work, both in terms of changing who we're funding, as well as like especially the process by which those decisions get made. That to me is like the key of like working in elements that get us outside our biases or into new audiences is really, really proactive work. And I would say in the year 2024 and the ways that things have changed for us, especially on the outreach side, but also in the design of our projects, is a lot more on the ground community work, just working in local communities and trying to elevate the voices in those communities into their own national level dialogues about ocean policy. And we work internationally, so I'm not just talking about the United States, but I really think working on the ground in communities is where the rubber honestly meets the road, and how you build a diverse coalition that wants to protect its special places and sustain the resources it depends on. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, and one other thing I'll add is, even though we're sunsetting, we are committed to honoring the commitments to our grantees and to ensuring that we live by these principles and we honor these principles and the remaining time that we have to support their work and the work into the future. So just wanted to add that as well.
I might be the last one to close you out, Kiki, on this question. Okay. I think I started with our DEI commitment being small yet meaningful steps for incremental and deep-rooted change, and we have stuck beside that, and we will continue to stick beside that to the best of our abilities. 2020 started with the scoping for the internal audit. 2021 started for the release of that audit. We had recommendations. We implemented them in 2022 and 2023. 2024, we did another internal review with surveys from our staff, from our close partners. We had interviews, and then we had a report as well. And we are continuing that work in the sense that we are now in the process of writing up a plan for how we're going to implement the next phase of this evaluation and the things that we want to see go differently over the next several years. So definitely an ongoing commitment. We are persisting, I think was the word you used. So we are excited to keep learning more in this space and growing as an organization in our commitment to this work as well.
So before we go to George, just while we're on this topic, I wanted to ask a brief follow-up, because a number of foundations, due to the Supreme Court decisions, have really pulled back. And so was LenFest, was that designed to be sunsetted now? Is that in response to the Supreme Court decision? And then for the others, are there concerns about within your foundations about the exposure that continuing these programs exposes the foundation to potential legal action?
Yeah, to answer your question, Paul, no, the initial intent of the LenFest gift to Pew to manage this project was to spend the principal of that gift within the lifetimes of the LenFest family, essentially Jerry and Marguerite LenFest. So we have effectively done our jobs, and we've spent that money and tried to shepherd it towards impactful and equitable and inclusive research and engagement. So that was the initial intent, and so we're just on the tail end of that without any interactions with any geopolitical or local domestic politics.
Okay.
I guess I'll jump in next. For the Ocean Coalition, our funders are Eric and Wendy Schmidt, so we don't necessarily have to go with the political winds the same way some others do. We do have to concern ourselves for our grantees, and one of our grantees, Pearside, will be speaking earlier. A lot of the Florida politics are affecting them, and we work with them to try and make sure that they can get their work done the best way that they want to get done. And if they have to adjust language in the grant language, that's perfectly fine by us. We try to be flexible to their needs.
George, do you want to?
Sure, thank you. My name is George Matsumoto. I use he, her, he, him pronouns, sorry. And I'm a senior education and research specialist at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. MBARI is relatively fortunate in that we have long-term funding from the David and Lucille Packard Foundation. And I know one of the complaints that I often hear is that long-term funding is difficult to get from federal organizations. And I'm sort of curious from your viewpoint and your organizations, perhaps except for LendFest, if you foresee a time when you could not necessarily guarantee, but give your grantees some assurance that their grants will be more sustainable, that maybe they could go for 5 years, 10 years with a potential for renewal as opposed to annual or 2 years or 3 years. And then sort of as a follow-on to that, I'm curious whether or not any of your grant applications are in additional languages. Thank you.
All right, I guess I'll jump in first then. Easy answer, we don't actually have a grant application package or portal. Our grant conversations start as just conversations with individuals we meet through networks, conferences, or wherever they may begin. And then it's a conversation, an email conversation back and forth to identify our grantees. And we're looking at multi-year. At the moment, we're looking at 1 to 2 year grants. There could be a conversation for long-term sustained granting. Our longest grantee thus far has been with us since the beginning of our granting program. And we're looking to continue that grant into next year, so that'll make it 4 years. The concern from our perspective on promising 5 years to any one individual or program is that it means that we don't have that flexible funding to move to another grantee who might be equally worthwhile. For us, the conversation of 1 to 2 year grants is as far as we seriously considered.
George, this is a great question. I'll jump in here as well while others are thinking, but even though our program is sunsetting, we have over the past 20 years been funding some topical areas over the long term. And I'll just point to a recent blog that I wrote with the help of some of my colleagues on really how there are a lot of benefits in thinking about longer visions of funding portfolios, not only for the uptake and use of science, but also what you're getting to in terms of sustainability and follow-on projects or follow-on, high impact support that can come, downstream of projects that may not be realized in 1, 2, or 3 year horizons. So I think it's a great question. I think it's one that, at least in private philanthropy needs to be considered internal to institutions on how they set those timelines for their opportunities, right? And why they're getting those monies out. I think we were lucky in our program in that we didn't necessarily have a specific timeline. So our director got to set a vision for certain projects. And when we were onboarded, about 8 years ago, we could look at a longer time horizon for some of these topical areas. And as they popped up, they were always in the back of our minds to make sure that we were thinking about sustainability, but also advancing either previous work or work that was complementary that could make a bigger splash or move the needle in certain topical areas. So I love this question and I'm really looking forward to hearing others talk about it.
Related to your question about languages too, our grant applications do come in English, but we have access to translation services and for all of our outreach. So many of our written materials will be translated into other languages, and we can also do events that include translation and stuff like that too, because we do have projects in many parts of the world.
Can I follow on Emily's point? We're partnered with Belmont Forum right now, and they're getting applications from all over the world, and they just are starting their first ever application process for applications to come in foreign languages, and they are using AI translation services. They said at the last meeting I was on a week ago that I think they got 115 or so applications, but only 2 of them were in foreign language. But those 2 applications are strong packages, and that the translation services worked for them.
Nessa, Karen, you want to comment?
Sure, yeah. Thanks for these questions. So this grant program that we specifically were talking about has not been translated into Spanish, but I have written it down as a thing that we should do, because it's something that we try to do for other things that we work on, like translating our partner toolkits for our communities that work in California, so that it can be used by all. So I think that's an awesome suggestion. I'm surprised we haven't done it to date. I also think the idea of increasing the time horizon for this reporting is really important. It was not the goal of this specific grant program that we run at NOPC. That is to have a very small scale, short time, like rapid kind of disbursement of funds. The one thing that I haven't heard mentioned necessarily, or maybe I haven't listened to it or been attuned to it, is that it sounds like most of us are re-granting. And I think another important facet of this conversation is providing direct funding to communities that are working on the ground to do this work. I understand that oftentimes there are barriers to doing that. For instance, you need the space to house the funds and the requirements to do some of these other things. But I do think that's a consideration and something that should be talked about a little bit more.
Karen, do you want to add?
Really think I have anything to add,
Okay.
except that I would love long-term funding, because it's really hard to build something and then cross your fingers every year. Just saying.
So I think next we have questions from Corey.
Yeah, Corey Garza, I'm the Associate Dean for DEI in the College of the Environment at the University of Washington. I had a question related to funding mechanisms. Often I'll work with a number of tribal authorities, in Washington. One of the things they often comment on is, even though they get approached a lot by either, federal or state agencies about, taking on award funds, they're not set up to receive them. And so, and I came out of the minority serving institution world, the same thing. We're smaller institutions that weren't originally set up to take on, different types of grant. I'm curious, how flexible are the award mechanisms that you use to disperse the funds, right, out of grants that have been selected to be awarded?
Yes, I'll go first. So for our funding, the perfect world is a 501c3. It's easy to move money in and through. In some cases, we've had stand-ins for an organization. So you're receiving the funds, but you have a partner that is a 501c3, but you're just an individual. So we'll send it to them and they can disperse to you. We have in some rare occasions dispersed direct to an individual, but that individual is already working on their 501c3, and we knew that was coming. It's just a level of clarity on who the individual and the group are that for us is kind of required.
Jason, is it horrible if I put you on the spot?
No,
I feel like you should say something
Sorry,
about including indigenous knowledge.
I was just talking a lot, so I was trying to give other folks an opportunity. Corey, it's a great question. I think flexibility in this space is actually should be on the front of minds for a lot of institutions, and kind of leads in from my other point about how, legal, finance, other components of an institution that does give resources has to be flexible and has to find ways internally on how to diversify those funding streams to different institutions. We do also fund or try to maintain flexibility and fund 501c3, but we also, academic institutions, we also can go directly to tribal nations that are representative and have the financial institutions set up to receive grant funds. So we try to be as flexible as possible. in our grants, not only to the indigenous knowledge sector, but in also other areas. Like we have a grant that's going to the Department of Fisheries Management in Thailand. So governments as well. So I think maintaining flexibility, I think on that financial mechanism side is really important to create flexibility in how you get to communities and how you get to the groups that really need the resources. So I love this question, and it's something that should be front of mind and top, high on the priority list, and trying to get resources to different groups and communities.
One more point I just wanted to follow up. We also partner with National Geographic Society, and we sail some of their explorers on the research vessel Falcor too. The point being, they are incredibly flexible. I have never worked with anybody who could actually just send the money directly to an individual. And they have that flexibility. They can put the money to just about anyone that they want. For SOI, we actually ran into a problem with that that we can talk about offline, but they are incredibly flexible in their funding mechanisms.
Karen, Nessa?
I mentioned it during my talk, but we also try to remove all barriers to engagement, as many as possible. That could mean adjusting deliverable timelines. It could mean, working within whatever kind of reporting, informal reporting that they need to do in order to be successful in this grant process. Like, we always try to get to yes in terms of working with our partners to try and make sure that they can be successful in the things that we've asked for, and streamline the process a lot and pared it down quite a bit so that it can be as easy as possible, and that they can have the creativity and freedom to do what makes sense for them and their communities.
I mean, we're not a grant making organization, but I will say that when we apply for funding for community partnerships, we are committed to ensuring that our community partners are also compensated. I think a lot of nonprofits will take that, and then it's like, oh, you get the free programs and pizza or whatever. And so we really work with all of the different granting agencies that that we solicit funds from, to ensure that community partners get compensated for their time and expertise and contributions. So I think that's also something, is finding local nonprofits who are open to that work, and then the money can kind of funnel in that way.
The only thing I'll add to this is that it's these kinds of mechanisms where an institution can express cultural sensitivities to how different communities work. So sometimes in the philanthropic funding space, it can feel like, well, we're giving, so we make the rules kind of thing. You can run the risk of kind of having that attitude, but rather meeting people where they are. So in terms of both funding mechanisms and grant reporting, so with including indigenous knowledge, for example, Jason co-developed the grant reporting process for those communities based in a way that worked for them, versus our standard process where you have to submit these reports and have these, 3 check-ins every 3, we kind of had this, and we were like, wait a second, that's fine for academic institutions, but this is a very different process, and we have to adjust and partner and do this in a way that sets the grantees up to achieve their goals. And that requires, I think, a lot of flexibility.
Thanks. Just again, a quick follow-up, since many of you mentioned 501c3 nonprofits, and I realize that there are IRS rules in terms of how foundations give money away, but in the ocean justice space, there's a lot of grassroots organizations where taking that step from being a grassroots organization to a legally recognized 501c3 is a pretty significant hurdle. Do any of your organizations provide resources or directions where you could help a grassroots organization get to the point where they are a 501c3 and can receive funding?
I'll jump in first. We don't offer help to do it, but should a grassroots organization come our way, we will say that this funding can be yours once that paperwork gets done, and we can point you to other people who are more experienced in this. But no one in the Ocean Coalition actually helps to usher that paperwork process forward.
Kiki?
Yeah, I do have questions I want to have answered, but I have already asked a question. I see that Ken's hand is raised. I'm gonna cede my space in the line to Ken and you can get back to me.
Thanks, Kiki. I hope you don't regret that decision. I'm Ken Matt, and my pronouns are he and him. I'm a long-term evaluator of the Myhoff Scholars Program. And I'm a community psychologist by training. So I'm inspired by the work you guys are doing with local communities, local groups, and focus on process of how you do things. I mean, this area is so important, as well as within your foundations. I'm also a program evaluator, so I wonder, is there, how you know that you're making a difference as a foundation in this space out there in the communities? And just with the election a week away, I have to say, is there reason for hope? A separate question, are you living in hope that your efforts will make a difference out there in communities?
Shut them right down. Any answer would be great.
As I said, Kiki, you may regret that you yielded to me.
I guess I'll jump in first again. So the last round of conversations was about what people use as assessment. And for Ocean Coalition, we tend to look at assessment based on what the grantees say is important to them. A lot of times we will just go with their annual reports. These are clearly the things you thought were important, so we're going to use those as our metrics. We see a lot of reason for smiling and being happy with the work we're doing and hope for the future. Our grantees are reporting that, for example, Bwings, the conference that she put together was far larger than she was ever expecting it to be when it first began. And a lot of our grantees are reporting that things are working better. There are more folks engaged in the work that they're doing. We are very happy with the grantees that we've worked with, and I think there's going to be some really exciting ones coming next year that we've already started conversations with. So I feel very positive, regardless of which way next week goes.
Yeah, I'll jump in. We actually do have a method by which we track impact as grantees implement the projects and work together. And I think what's interesting about it is we basically have like a set of indicators that we use, and we have like a spreadsheet where we track it over time, like results getting taken up in a decision, prompting media outreach, whatever. We have like just a whole series that we track it by. And the utility of the method is that it allows us to kind of connect the dots, because it's very difficult to have quantifiable metrics related to that. So that we definitely do the best we can. But outside of that, I think the thing that I will say is that the ability to iterate, I think, is almost most important. The ability to revisit something, to adjust, to fix something if like the research changes or the policy landscape changes, is really kind of key, because you can't anticipate everything. So like an example project, for example, is we have a project called Marine Biodiversity Dialogues that in its first iteration, it was creating a national level assessment of the distribution and abundance of marine biodiversity in US waters. So this big national framework. But as we went on in doing that, we recognized, what does this mean to a community in the Chesapeake Bay? What does this mean to a community in the Gulf of Mexico? So then we funded another like deeper iteration of the project, where those grantees reformed a whole bunch of new partnerships with other experts and other knowledge holders, and then went into 3 key regions to work with Indigenous knowledge holders, charter boat captains, community leaders, state managers, and actually like ground truth the national level assessment and say, where does this meet you where you're at? And how does this need to adjust? And so I think that ability to be like, oh, we've learned this and now we have to tact this way, is really critical. As for next week, I know it's crazy. I have no idea what's going to happen. I draw a lot of hope from the on the ground community work and using our funding to help people sustain their resources or solve their own problems. A lot of the money we put out is about helping people have the capacity and the resources they need to do what they need to do. And so that definitely gives me a lot. That part gives me hope.
Vanessa, Karen, do you want to add?
One indicator of knowing that we're making a difference is the ongoing and growing interest in the program. So there has been program funding that's more than doubled in the last 2 years that we've run this grant program, and also the applicant pool has dramatically increased as well, even extending beyond like our insular partner base, and that's a good thing. We want that this information be getting out there, and we want to be able to try and resource as many programs as possible so that they can build a foundation for bringing their excellent ideas and work elsewhere. And as for living in a space of hope, I guess the short answer is yes. And then also, much like Emily, the immense dedication and creativity and leadership and vision of the individuals that are on the ground and leading this work is so incredibly, I feel so fortunate to be a part of it and observe it on the day-to-day. And so any chance that we can have to cultivate or support or do whatever we can to be a part of that, I am grateful for, and I want to contribute to. So I think I'm living in a knowledge of the kids are going to be all right. Like things are going to be okay. But I am also hopeful, very hopeful.
Yeah, building off of what Vanessa was saying too, I remain hopeful as well, and very much echoing what Emily and Vanessa talked about and just seeing and hearing, from either the projects that we funded or the projects that, or the complementary efforts that are ongoing, and how folks are feeling empowered into making change within their communities for good. And I think that gives me hope, regardless of what happens next week. I think as long as we all, focus on these kinds of discussions, on making progress and finding ways to help those folks remain empowered to create those change for positive change in their communities. I think that's what keeps hope, the hope's fire in me.
Karen?
I'm not going to talk about next week because that's a little stressful for me. But what I do think is important is that measuring that impact is key. We have a team of research and evaluation staff that are part of the education department, and we sort of go by our focus is really